I smelled it before I saw it. The sharp, green scent of freshly snapped pine and the damp, metallic tang of overturned earth. It was 6 a.m., the sun just a faint, bloody smear in the east, and the air by the lake should have been still. But it was thick with the smell of sawdust and destruction. I'd been coming to this cabin, the one my father and I built with our own hands, for 40 years. It was my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude. I rounded the final wooded bend of the long gravel driveway, and my heart just stopped. It wasn't a cabin anymore. It was a grave. Where my home had stood just a week ago, there was now nothing. It was gone. Annihilated. This wasn't a fire. This wasn't a storm. This was an execution. A brutal, methodical pulverizing of my entire life. The structure, the roof, the porch where my late wife and I drank our coffee, it had all been torn down, crushed, and bulldozed directly into its own foundation. It was a pile of splintered lumber, shattered glass, and pulverized memories. I just sat there in my truck, the engine idling, my coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at a hole in the world that had, for 4 decades, been my center. I need to know, have you ever had that feeling? That moment where the world tilts on its axis and you realize something unforgivable has just happened? Before we go one step further, I need you to stop right now and comment. Where are you watching this from? And what exact time is it in your city? I want to know exactly who is with me on this, because what happened next, you just won't believe. The silence of the morning was deafening. There was no birdsong. There was just the quiet ticking of my truck's engine and the gaping, violent wound where my home used to be. I didn't panic. I didn't yell. I didn't fall apart. My pulse went cold, and 35 years of federal training took over. I am, or I was, a federal wildlife officer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. My entire career was spent enforcing federal land law, tracking poachers, and investigating environmental crimes. I was no longer a homeowner. I was a federal officer arriving at a crime scene. I turned off the truck, stepped out into the damp air, and my boots crunched on the gravel. My eyes automatically began to survey the scene. The destruction was brutal, but it was also efficient. The deep, fresh tracks in the mud told me it was a heavy backhoe, maybe a full-sized excavator. They had come in from the main access road, torn it all down, and then pushed the debris, the chimney, the appliances, my wife's goddamned rocking chair, straight into the foundation hole. It was a demolish and bury. And that's when I saw her. Standing by the main road, next to a newly hammered-in, bright red no trespassing sign bearing the HOA logo, was the president. Mara Jansen. She was in her late 50s, wearing a pristine white windbreaker, her silver hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun. She was holding a clipboard to her chest, watching me with a smug, reptilian smile, her head tilted slightly, as if she were admiring a piece of modern art she'd just commissioned. She had been waiting for me. She wanted to see this. She wanted to watch my face as I discovered she had ripped my life apart. She began to walk toward me, her new sneakers crunching on the gravel, the picture of calm, bureaucratic authority. "A terrible shame, isn't it, Mr. Weller?" she chirped, her voice dripping with a fraudulent sympathy that made my skin crawl. A real tragedy. But the Lakeside Pines bylaws are crystal clear. The board reviewed your case, and unfortunately, you were more than 30 days past due on your $300 community fee. We had to act. The integrity of the association, you understand? I just stared at her. My mind was trying to process the sheer, monstrous disproportionality of it. She had just confessed to annihilating my home, my legacy, over $300? My gaze drifted from her cold, dead eyes to the wreckage, and I saw it. Nailed to a single, splintered support beam, The only piece of the cabin still standing more than 3 feet high was a laminated piece of paper. It was a final notice of demolition. I walked over to it, the nails of the floorboards I'd laid myself crunching under my boots. I ripped the notice from the wood. It was an invoice for $300. And the date at the top? It was dated yesterday. They had given me less than 24 hours' notice. They knew I wasn't here. This wasn't a last resort. This wasn't an action. This was a premeditated ambush. This was a land grab, plain and simple. She thought she could destroy my property, bury it, and then seize the land when I, a delinquent owner, failed to pay the $50,000 demolition and cleanup bill she was undoubtedly planning to send me next. She thought I was some poor, defenseless old man she could roll over. She thought this was the end of the story. She had no idea what she had just done. I looked at the pulverized pile of wood that used to be my wife's reading nook. I looked at the broken shards of the stained glass window my father and I had installed in 1978. I looked at the fresh, deep tracks of the bulldozer that had crushed it all as if it were nothing. And then I looked back at Mara Jansen, who was still smiling that cold, tight, self-satisfied smile. The rage that came over me wasn't hot. It was Arctic. It was a cold, pure, clarifying rage that sharpened the entire world into a single point. I folded the fraudulent notice in my hand. I turned to face her. My voice was perfectly calm, perfectly steady. It was the same voice I used right before I put handcuffs on a poacher. "Mara," I said, her name tasting like ash. "What you just did, it wasn't a demolition. It was a confession. You just signed your own indictment." Her smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Weller. This is HOA business. It's perfectly legal. You should have paid your fee." I didn't answer her. I just pulled out my cell phone. She probably thought I was calling 911. She probably thought I was going to cry or yell or call a lawyer. She had no idea. I wasn't calling the local sheriff. I wasn't calling a lawyer. I was calling my daughter. I was calling Special Agent in Charge Dana Weller of the FBI's Public Corruption Division. Mara Jansen hadn't just declared war on a retired wildlife officer. She had declared war on a family that dismantles people like her for a living. She didn't know that my son at Homeland Security was already tracing the IP address of the demolition company. She didn't know that my youngest, a postal inspector, was about to launch a federal investigation into the fraudulent $300 bill she had so stupidly sent through the U.S. mail. She had no idea that she wasn't just standing at a demolition site. She was standing at the epicenter of a federal racketeering case, and my kids, they were all on their way. To understand the sheer catastrophic stupidity of what Mara Jansen had just done, you have to understand who she had just attacked. She, and the puppet board she controlled, saw my name on a file. Tom Weller. They saw a 68-year-old widower. They saw an out-of-town owner who only used his cabin on the weekends. They saw a soft target, a victim. They assumed, in their profound and venomous arrogance, that I was just some grumpy old pensioner they could bully, fine, and ultimately crush, just like they had apparently been doing to everyone else on this lake for the last decade. What these people, in their criminal ignorance, failed to comprehend was what my job actually was. My entire life, my entire 35-year career, was spent as a federal wildlife officer. I wasn't a park ranger. I was a cop, a federal cop. My jurisdiction was the land itself. My service wasn't just about protecting ducks. It was about enforcing complex federal law. I was a specialist in land use, riparian rights, and environmental statutes. I have stood toe-to-toe with armed poacher rings, illegal logging operations, and multi-million-dollar corporations dumping toxic waste. My job was to investigate, build a case, and drag those very people into federal court. I have forgotten more about the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act than any high-priced HOA lawyer will ever know. I know this land. I know the watersheds. I know the boundaries. And I knew, with the certainty of a physical law, that my cabin, the one my grandfather secured the deed for in 1962, a deed that was recorded decades before her Lakeside Pines HOA was even a fantasy in some developer's head, was never part of her jurisdiction. But the real mistake she made wasn't just attacking me, it was attacking my family. This cabin wasn't just my property, it was a legacy. It was the last place my wife, Sarah, had been healthy. And Sarah, God rest her soul, had been a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. My children didn't just grow up around the law, they were forged by it. They were raised at a dinner table where we discussed case law, not sitcoms. They learned to read by looking at legal briefs. And when they grew up, they didn't just get jobs. They answered a call. My oldest, Dana. She's not just an agent. She's the special agent in charge of the FBI's Public Corruption Division for this entire region. She doesn't just investigate crime. She dismantles criminal enterprises. She eats people like Mara Jansen for breakfast. When I called her from the wreckage, I could hear the click of her keyboard before I even finished the sentence. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was the lead investigator on a new case. My middle son, Ray, he's the quiet one. He's a lead cybersecurity analyst for the Department of Homeland Security. He lives in the digital darkness. He finds the footprints that people think they've erased. To him, a fraudulent HOA, a shell company for a demolition crew, and a forged plat map aren't just paperwork. They are a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading right back to the source. And then there's my youngest, Mark. He's the one people always underestimate, and he loves it. He's a U.S. Postal Inspector. The Silent Service. He's a federal agent with a gun and a badge who relentlessly prosecutes any crime that touches the U.S. mail. And that fraudulent, extortive $300 bill that Mara had so stupidly mailed to my permanent address? That wasn't just a piece of paper. That was a federal felony. That was his jurisdiction. So when Mara Jansen ordered that backhoe to tear down my home, she wasn't just crushing a building. She was ringing the dinner bell for the most dangerous, legally minded, and relentless family of federal agents in the entire state. In the 3 years since Sarah passed, this cabin was all I had left of her. I was the one who helped the other neighbors navigate the legal permit process for their docks. I was the one who organized the annual community cleanup of the lake. I was the respected, quiet authority. Mara was a cheap, power-hungry knockoff. She had built her little kingdom on fear. She had no idea what real authority looked like. She had no idea that in her blind greed, she hadn't just committed a civil trespass. She had, in one morning, committed mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and multiple massive federal environmental crimes. We weren't just going to get the land back. We were going to get her. We were going to rip her corrupt organization apart, root and stem, and scatter the pieces in the wind. The fight was on. To understand how a petty tyrant like Mara Jansen gets bold enough to illegally demolish a man's home, you have to understand the kingdom she built. This wasn't just an HOA. It was a criminal enterprise, a corrupt fiefdom disguised as a community association. She had been president of the Lakeside Pines HOA for 10 years, and in that time, she had meticulously consolidated her power, turning the board of directors into her own personal rubber stamp politburo. She ruled through a potent, toxic combination of selective enforcement, public humiliation, and weaponized bureaucracy. Her corruption was a three-headed beast. First, she manipulated the board itself. She held emergency votes at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays when every sane person was at work. She fabricated proxies from out-of-state owners. She stacked the board with her two cronies, a senile old man who just signed whatever she put in front of him, and her own brother-in-law, a man named Stan, who just happened to own the only HOA-approved demolition and construction company in the county. It was a closed loop of corruption. Second, there was the scam itself. This $300 fee wasn't an accident. It was a trap. My property, the Weller property, was never part of her HOA. I had the 1962 deed to prove it. But I was an absentee owner. So as my daughter Dana discovered in about 10 minutes of database searches, Mara had filed a forged plat map with the county clerk's office 6 months ago. It was a subtle, insidious piece of fraud. She had just nudged the boundary line of her HOA on the map, a few hundred yards here, a few hundred yards there, until it miraculously annexed my valuable lakefront property. She didn't tell me. She didn't notify anyone. She just filed the paper. Then, she sent the bill. The $300 fee was the bait. It was an amount so insultingly small that she assumed I would just grumble and pay it to make her go away. The moment I wrote that check, the moment my signature hit that paper, I would have legally acknowledged her fraudulent jurisdiction. I would have consented to the annexation. My refusal to pay wasn't a financial problem for her. It was a defiance. It was a challenge to her authority. And in Mara's kingdom, defiance had to be met with total, overwhelming, annihilating force. The demolition wasn't a punishment. It was an execution, meant to be a public spectacle to terrorize every other resident on that lake. And that leads to the third head of the beast, her political ties. How did she get away with filing a forged map? How could she operate with such impunity? Her cousin was a low-level but strategically placed commissioner on the county zoning board. This cousin wasn't powerful, but he was a gatekeeper. He rubber-stamped her liens. He fast-tracked her demolition permits. And most importantly, any time a resident filed a formal complaint against her with the county, the paperwork would just disappear. It would get lost in the system. This simple, dirty trick made Mara look untouchable. It made her look like she had the entire county government in her pocket, which, in turn, made the residents too terrified to ever fight back. I wasn't the first person she had targeted. This was a pattern. This was her business model. I learned about the Millers, an elderly couple who had owned a small lot near the entrance to the community. Mara had buried them in fines. Fines for non-compliant grass height, fines for the unapproved color of their mailbox, fines for a small storage shed that had been there for 20 years. She fined them over $15,000. When they couldn't pay, she slapped a lien on their house, dragged them through a legal battle she knew they couldn't afford, and bled them dry. In the end, they were forced to sell their property just to cover the legal fees, and the buyer, hiding behind a shell LLC, was Mara herself. She bought their land for pennies on the dollar. She was a land pirate, plain and simple. She was running a criminal enterprise. She thought her cousin at the county office made her bulletproof. She thought her sham voting board made her legal. She thought her brother-in-law's backhoe made her powerful. She had no idea what real jurisdiction looked like. She had no idea that the community she had so carefully cleansed was now the target of a multi-agency federal task force. She was a predator, yes, but she had just, in her infinite greed, tried to swallow a porcupine. And we were about to rip her apart from the inside out. The war room wasn't a room at all. It was the back booth of a dimly lit diner 20 miles away from the lake. My kids had rolled in, one by one, not in sirens and flashing lights, but with the quiet, grim efficiency of a stormfront building on the horizon. Dana, my daughter, was there first, her laptop already open, a secure federal broadband card glowing blue. Ray, my son from DHS, sat across from her, his own laptop a fortress of encryption. Mark, my youngest, the Postal Inspector, was sipping coffee, a legal pad in front of him, already diagramming the flow of the crime. I just sat there, the man whose life had just been pulverized, and I watched my children go to work. This wasn't a family meeting. This was a federal briefing. "All right," Dana said, her voice low and sharp. She was in charge. "This isn't a civil matter. This is public corruption, clear and simple. She's using a quasi-governmental position, her HOA presidency, and conspiring with a county official to deprive you of your property. That's a federal crime. She's also conspired with her brother-in-law to destroy the property, which is another felony. I'm opening a preliminary investigation file right now. We're going to pull her financials, her brother-in-law's financials, and the financials of the HOA itself." Mark, my postal inspector, tapped his pen on the table. "Dad, that $300 bill, you said it came in the mail? To your home address?" I nodded. "Yes, standard mail." A cold, thin smile spread across Mark's face. "Got her," he said. "That's mail fraud, Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1341. Using the U.S. Postal Service in furtherance of a scheme to defraud. It's a 20-year felony, per count. That one letter just gave me jurisdiction to seize every single one of her financial records. She's not just an HOA bully anymore. She's my case." He was already typing into his own secured device, opening an official investigation file. Using the U.S. mail to commit a crime is like sending a signed invitation to a federal agent, and Mara had just sent hers directly to my son. "She's sloppy," Ray said, his eyes never leaving his screen. He was the digital ghost. "She's arrogant, and that makes her sloppy. She had to file that forged plat map with the county. Give me a minute." He wasn't hacking. He was just walking in. He had high-level clearance to access any state or county municipal database in the country. "Okay, I'm in the county assessor's records. Here's the original 1962 plat map. Clear as day. Your parcel, 77B, is completely outside their boundary. Now, here's her forgery, filed 6 months ago." He brought up a second map. The line was almost imperceptibly different, a slight bulge, a tiny correction that just so happened to swallow my half-mile of lakefront. "She just drew a new line, but she's an idiot." Ray's fingers flew. "I'm pulling the metadata from the digital file she uploaded to the county server, and got it. Uploaded from a standard home IP address, registered to Mara Jansen, 122 Lakeside Drive." He hadn't just found the gun. He'd found the fingerprint, the security camera footage, and the confession. Then it was my turn. I was the land expert. I was the boots on the ground. I pulled out my own phone and brought up the photos I had taken just an hour ago, not of the cabin, but of the wreckage. "Kids," I said, "it's even worse than you think. And she's much, much dumber." I zoomed in on the edge of the property line, where the land sloped down to the water. "Look." The photos were clear. The backhoe operator hadn't hauled the debris away. He had used his bucket to push tons of it, shingles, insulation, drywall, wiring, concrete footings, directly into the lake. He'd used the wreckage of my home as illegal fill, creating a crude, toxic new shoreline. Dana's eyes went wide. "Oh my God. Dad, is that—" "That's the primary watershed," I said, my voice like gravel. "She didn't just dump trash. She illegally filled a federally protected waterway. That's a direct, catastrophic violation of the Clean Water Act, Section 404. That's not just a fine, that's criminal liability. And by obstructing a navigable waterway, she also just violated the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. The table went silent. My kids just looked at me. Mark was the one who broke the silence. "So, in one day," he said, "she's managed to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, public corruption, and she's invited the FBI, the EPA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to the party, all for $300. Dana closed her laptop. The trap was no longer a theory. It was a fully built, multi-agency federal case. Okay, she said. We're no longer on defense. We're on offense. We're not just going to get the land back. We're not just going to sue her. We are going to dismantle her. We are going to seize her assets, revoke her charter, and put her in a federal prison. She looked at me. Dad, this is your case. What do you want? I thought about my wife's rocking chair, now at the bottom of the lake. I want her, I said. I want all of them. I want her entire corrupt organization burned to the ground. Mara Jansen, drunk on the high of her own power, had absolutely no idea that she was no longer a person. She was a target. She was the subject of a preliminary federal investigation. And like all arrogant predators, she couldn't help but overplay her hand. High on her victory of annihilating my home, she immediately made her next move, believing she had crushed me into submission. The very next morning, a new truck arrived at my property. This time it was a flatbed from her brother-in-law's company, Jansen Demolition. They weren't there to clean up. They were there to build a cage. With a loud, metallic crash that echoed across the lake, they dropped a 30-yard industrial dumpster directly at the entrance of my gravel driveway, completely blocking any access to my land. But they weren't done. After the dumpster was in place, a smaller truck pulled up. Two men hopped out, and right in front of the massive steel barrier, they hammered a huge 4-by-8-foot sign into the earth. It read, "For sale by HOA, prime lakefront lot." They were actively trying to sell my land. My land. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive. She had demolished my home, blocked my access to the property, and was now listing it for sale, all in the span of 48 hours. She wasn't just a tyrant. She was a pirate, raising her flag over her conquered territory. Of course, the final insult arrived later that day. Not by mail. She wasn't stupid enough to make that mistake twice. No, this one was delivered by a private courier, a thin, nervous man who left the envelope taped to the dumpster. I peeled it off. It was a new invoice. This one wasn't for $300. This one was for $55,000. It was a bill for community cleansing services, emergency demolition, debris removal, and lot grading. She had illegally destroyed my home, and now she was charging me a fortune for the privilege. It was the classic extortionist's playbook: create a debt that can't be paid, then offer to forgive it in exchange for the asset. But her arrogance didn't stop at physical intimidation and fraudulent bills. She had to take it public. That night, she posted on the official Lakeside Pines HOA Facebook page. I saw it because another terrified neighbor sent me the screenshot. It was a picture of my demolished lot, taken from the road, showing the new "For Sale" sign. Her caption read, "So happy to announce the successful removal of a non-compliant, derelict structure that has been a blight on our community for years. We are cleansing our neighborhood one lot at a time and making way for a beautiful new home that actually respects our property values. Protecting our community." She had just created a permanent, public, digital record of her motive, her actions, and her malice. This was the opening my kids had been waiting for. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The harassment was now undeniable, documented, and public. On my daughter Dana's advice, I made the call. I used a burner phone, a simple prepaid device. We needed a clean recording, and my son, Ray, the DHS analyst, handled the trace and encryption. I dialed the main number for the HOA. Mara picked up herself, her voice bright and syrupy. "Lakeside Pines, this is Mara." I put on the voice of a broken, defeated, desperate old man. My voice trembled. Mara, it's Tom Weller. Please, I got your bill. $55,000. I don't have this. I'm an old man. My cabin is gone. Isn't that enough? What do you want from me?" There was a pause on the line. It was the silence of a predator savoring the kill. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold, smug, and dripping with condescending power. She thought she had won. She thought I was shattered. "It is a shame, Tom," she said, the fake sympathy gone, replaced by the voice of a shark closing a deal. "But the bill is the bill. The community has to be reimbursed for the service we provided. You should have thought of that before you let your property fall apart and refused to pay your dues." "But I can't pay it," I pleaded. "You've ruined me. Please, isn't there another way?" And then she did it. She walked right into the trap. "Well," she said, drawing the word out, "I suppose the board might be willing to forgive the debt. We're not monsters, Tom. We just want what's best for the community. You could just sign the deed over to the HOA, sign the land over to us, and we'll call it even. It's really the only way you're going to avoid collections. And believe me, you don't want to go to collections." I hung up. I looked at my kids. Dana, who had been listening on speaker, just smiled. She hadn't been recording the call on an app. The entire call had been routed through a secure, federally monitored server. It was a legal, admissible recording. She looked at her brother Mark, the Postal Inspector, and whispered, "And that's extortion." Mara Jansen thought she was closing a real estate deal. She had just, on a federally recorded line, confessed to a felony. The trap wasn't just set. It was sprung. The hammer didn't just fall. It obliterated Mara Jansen's entire world. And it happened, as my daughter Dana had planned, not in some quiet, dark alley, but in the one place Mara felt most powerful, in the middle of her own kingdom, at the public monthly HOA meeting. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a room Mara had decorated herself, with her two board cronies sitting beside her at the head table. She was at the podium, a smug, satisfied smirk on her face, discussing the wonderful new opportunity presented by the successful community cleansing of the derelict Weller lot, and the prime new property that would soon be for sale to a deserving new owner. The other 20 homeowners in the room just sat there, terrified, silent, staring at their laps. That's when the doors at the back of the room opened. The first two people who walked in weren't in suits. They were in tactical green vests with bold yellow letters on the back. EPA, Criminal Investigation Division. The room went dead silent. Mara froze, her mouth half open. The two agents walked calmly down the center aisle. "Mara Jansen," one of them said, his voice booming in the small room. "We are here with a federal stop work order for all HOA properties bordering the lake. You are in direct and catastrophic violation of the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act. All HOA assets are hereby frozen, pending a full environmental impact study of the illegal fill you dumped into the lake." The homeowners gasped. Mara's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "You will," the agent said. But before he could continue, the doors opened again. This time, it was my son, Mark. He was in his full, crisp, dark blue U.S. Postal Inspector uniform, his badge gleaming on his chest. He looked like a force of nature. He walked right up to the head table, ignoring Mara, and spoke to her treasurer. "Sir," he said, "I am a federal agent with the United States Postal Inspection Service. I have a federal warrant to seize all financial records, all invoices, all computers, and all correspondence related to the transmission of fraudulent bills via the U.S. mail. You will step away from that laptop, now." Mara just stared at his uniform, her brain completely short-circuiting. She looked at the EPA. She looked at Mark. She couldn't understand how a mailman was arresting her. And then, the doors opened a final time. My daughter, Dana, flanked by two other FBI agents in dark suits, walked in. She moved with a silent, lethal purpose. She walked right up to the podium, past the EPA agents, past Mark, and stood directly in front of Mara Jansen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Mara Jansen," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States, mail fraud, wire fraud, and extortion." As Dana pulled Mara's hands behind her back, and the metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the room, the lead EPA agent turned to the horrified homeowners. "Just so everyone is aware," he announced, "the community cleansing Mrs. Jansen ordered involved illegally dumping tons of toxic building materials, including asphalt shingles, insulation, and wiring, into your lake." A wave of panic and rage went through the crowd. This wasn't just my problem anymore. She had poisoned their lake. At that exact same moment, as my son Ray confirmed from a remote van, a separate FBI team was raiding her cousin's office at the county zoning board. And as Mara was being led out of the room, past her stunned, terrified neighbors, she finally saw me. I was standing in the back, by the doors, with my arms crossed. I just nodded at her, once. Her entire empire, her entire world, had just been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. The trial was a formality. It was a legal execution. Mara Jansen's defense, her entire persona as a concerned community leader, completely evaporated against the cold, hard, unassailable mountain of federal evidence. My kids had built a case so airtight, so overwhelmingly brutal, that her high-priced lawyer could do nothing but watch. Ray, my son from DHS, took the stand and, in a calm, monotone voice, presented the digital evidence. The metadata from the forged plat map, pulled from the county server, time-stamped, and digitally signed with her home IP address. He showed the jury the internal HOA emails, recovered from her deleted files, where she explicitly discussed the Weller problem and her plan to force the old man out. Then came Mark, my postal inspector. He stood before the court in his full uniform and held up the single piece of paper that had started the federal avalanche, the fraudulent 300 bill. He explained to the jury, in meticulous, damning detail, how that single piece of mail constituted a federal felony and had given him the authority to seize her entire financial world, uncovering the years of kickbacks to her brother-in-law's demolition company. The jury was captivated. This wasn't just a local dispute. This was a textbook case of a criminal enterprise. But the final, devastating blow was the audio recording. Dana didn't even have to take the stand. The prosecution just played the tape. The whole courtroom, the judge, the jury, the other homeowners who had come to watch, sat in stunned silence as they heard Mara's cold, smug voice. "I suppose the board might be willing to forgive the debt. You could just sign the deed over to the HOA. We'll call it even. Believe me, you don't want to go to collections." It was the sound of a predator confessing, of an extortionist caught in her own trap. She was convicted on all counts. The judge was incensed. He was a veteran who had clearly seen his share of HOA tyrants. In his sentencing, he called her actions a monstrous and criminal abuse of power, motivated by pure, unadulterated greed. He made an example of her. Mara Jansen was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Her brother-in-law, who had testified against her in a desperate attempt to save himself, got 5 years for conspiracy and the environmental crimes. Her cousin at the zoning board was fired, disgraced, and convicted of public corruption. But the judge wasn't done. He turned to the civil restitution. He ordered Mara from her own, personal assets, not the HOA's, to pay full market rate restitution for the total replacement value of my cabin. Her assets, her home, her bank accounts, all seized. And the final, beautiful, systemic victory. The state attorney general, citing the pattern of gross criminality and fraud uncovered by the federal investigation, filed a motion and formally dissolved the Lakeside Pines HOA charter. Its assets were seized by the state, and the homeowners were, for the first time in a decade, completely and totally free. 6 months later, I was back at the lake. It was quiet again. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had just finished their environmental cleanup, a massive project paid for by the fines levied against Mara's seized estate. And standing on the old foundation was a brand new cabin, stronger and more beautiful than the old one, paid for entirely by Mara's personal bank account. My kids were all there with me. Dana was on the new porch, reading a book. Ray was skipping stones on the clean water. Mark was, as always, making coffee. They didn't just destroy my cabin over $300. They destroyed their entire lives over it. They thought they were fighting some helpless old man. They had no idea they were picking a fight with a family that is the law. And every morning now, when I sit on that new porch, I drink my coffee, and I'm reminded of a simple, fundamental truth. You can't fight the law, especially when the law is family.